What would happen if the weakest servant trainee in Habsburg Manor discovered that every ordinary skill could become a path to power? Rain. Kalen woke with a massive bump on his head, memories from another life, and the terrible realization that a donkey had nearly ended his new existence. By the time his enemies understood what that scrawny farmer's son was becoming, monsters, mercenaries, and assassins would already be hunting him. It was harvest month in Shining Gold Town, a quiet settlement inside Meister County. Rain found himself lying in the outer courtyard of Habsburg Manor while a group of teenage boys gathered around a black donkey. An hour earlier, that same donkey had kicked him directly in the skull. The pain was unpleasant, but the memories flooding his mind were far more shocking. They belonged to the original owner of his body. His name was Rain Kalen. He was a thin, black-haired boy from a poor tenant farming family. 2 days earlier, Rain had entered the manor's servant training program. His parents had spent most of their savings and used their connection with a head servant just to secure his place. In this world, territorial nobles selected household servants while they were young. The children received basic training before competing for permanent positions. Some became stable hands. Others became guards, cooks, blacksmith apprentices, or dog trainers. 3 months later, Habsburg Manor would hold its selection exam. Only 5 trainees would be recruited. 2 positions belonged to blacksmith apprentices. 2 more belonged to guards. The final position was for a dog trainer. Rain had somehow transmigrated into another world, and his first great objective was to pass an exam so he could become someone else's servant. It was hardly the heroic beginning he might have imagined. A furious shout from the manor blacksmith dragged him back to reality. Master Bar was yelling at 2 boys who could not hold down the donkey's hoof. Both trainees were nearly as skinny as Rain. Against the animal's strength, they had no chance. A group of larger boys stood nearby and laughed. Their clothes were noticeably better than those worn by the poorer trainees. They were sons of tavern owners, innkeepers, and local craftsmen. Within the small world of Shining Gold Town, they considered themselves rich. They also enjoyed bullying everyone beneath them. Rain had already been forced to clean the dormitory every day by himself. That chore was supposed to rotate between trainees. The boy with thick eyebrows was especially arrogant. His name was Richard, and his family owned a tavern. Beside him stood a freckle-faced boy who usually supported every cruel idea Richard had. Rain quietly memorized their faces. He lowered his head and allowed them to believe their mockery bothered him. In reality, he was listening to their conversation. Rain desperately needed information about his new world. Richard's group mentioned that Alborough Town had recently been attacked by a wandering ogre. Several people had died. Another boy spoke about a cult performing a human sacrifice in a nearby settlement. Rain's attention sharpened immediately. Ogres and human sacrifices did not sound like harmless village gossip. The original Rain had never traveled beyond this small region. He knew only the stories carried by merchants and travelers. Those stories spoke of monsters hiding in darkness. They described strange creatures beneath the sea. Some warned of haunted houses and unnatural plagues. The original Rain had dismissed everything as fairy tales. The new Rain was no longer certain. Master Bar suddenly called Rain and George forward. George was a blonde trainee and one of Rain's few genuine friends. Together, the 2 boys grabbed the donkey's leg. Bar began trimming the hoof with a heavy iron scraper. The final hoof was infected. A small amount of pus leaked from the damaged area. The donkey immediately began thrashing. Rain held on with every bit of strength his weak body possessed. Less than 2 minutes later, sweat covered his face. His black hair stuck to his forehead. His arms trembled. When Bar finally finished, Rain and George collapsed onto the ground. Richard's group burst into laughter. George flushed with embarrassment. Rain barely heard them. Something transparent had appeared in front of his eyes. It resembled a floating glass panel covered in small words. The panel informed him that he had assisted with hoof trimming. His related comprehension had improved. He had learned a new skill, hoof trimming. The skill had gained 1 point of experience. Then another message appeared. Rain had unlocked the blacksmith apprentice profession. His heart began pounding. A donkey had kicked him into another world. Now trimming that donkey's hoof had given him a system. The situation had suddenly become much more interesting. Rain focused on the profession panel as everyone returned to work. The title identified him as a level 1 blacksmith apprentice. A grid of dark skill icons filled most of the panel. Only one icon was visible. It showed a hoof beside a black iron scraper. That was his newly acquired hoof trimming skill. Rain wondered why the system considered hoof care part of blacksmithing. Perhaps it was because Bar was teaching him. Perhaps blacksmiths in this world traditionally handled such work. The exact explanation did not matter yet. In a medieval society, blacksmithing was already an extremely valuable profession. George noticed the grin spreading across Rain's face. He asked whether the donkey had damaged Rain's brain. Rain ignored the insult and immediately asked Master Bar for another turn. Every trainee stared at him. George genuinely seemed worried. Nobody volunteered for additional hoof work. Nobody except Rain. Engels the tanner's son happily surrendered his position. The boy wanted to become a guard. To him, donkey hooves were beneath his status. Rain could not have been more grateful. He worked for the entire morning. His arms eventually shook so violently that he physically could not continue. The body he had inherited was painfully weak, yet every small system notification made the suffering worthwhile. Rain soon discovered that skill experience and profession experience were different. Hoof trimming improved quickly through repeated work. The blacksmith apprentice profession advanced much more slowly. Rain guessed that hoof trimming had only limited relevance to true blacksmithing. That created an immediate problem. The manor possessed only a few dozen donkeys. Another day of work would finish them all. After that, Rain might wait an entire month before seeing those hooves again. The selection exam was only 3 months away. He needed faster methods. Rain opened his attribute panel. His constitution was 5. His strength was 4. His agility was 6. His spirit was 8. An average adult man possessed approximately 6 points in each basic attribute. Rain finally understood why the donkey had nearly dragged him across the courtyard. His strength was terrible. His unusually high spirit was more interesting. Rain suspected the merger of 2 sets of memories might have strengthened his mind. Before he could examine the possibility, lunch was announced. The trainees received black bread, half a smoked fish, and watery vegetable soup. Everyone around Rain looked delighted. He picked up the black bread. It felt like a brick. Following the others, he broke it apart and soaked the pieces in soup. One bite almost made him spit everything out. There were wood shavings inside the bread. Rain suddenly missed the suspicious processed food of his former life. At least mystery meat had still been meat. George was too distracted to notice Rain's suffering. A young maid named Sophia was clearing tables nearby. Half the boys secretly watched her. George was practically hypnotized. Rain casually told him that staring 100 times would not make Sophia his. George's entire face turned red. He immediately denied looking at her. Rain calmly pointed out that he had never mentioned Sophia's name. George fell silent. For the first time, he seriously wondered whether the donkey kick had made Rain smarter. That afternoon, Rain returned to hoof trimming. Every muscle hurt. The system's constant experience notifications kept him moving. Then approximately 20 young men and women entered the outer courtyard. They were close to Rain's age. Their bodies were stronger. Their clothes were finer. These were children of wealthy merchants and lower-ranking nobles beneath Count Habsburg. They had come for night squire training. Rain glanced at Richard and the other supposedly rich trainees. Compared with the newcomers, Richard's group suddenly looked very ordinary. Master Bar warned his trainees not to stare. He bluntly explained that those noble youths had been born on a level common servants might never reach. Learning a useful trade was already a comfortable future for boys like Rain. In this society, moving between social classes was almost impossible. Rain understood Bar's reasoning. Then a single sword strike showed him why accepting that ceiling might be fatal. A gigantic armored man stepped onto the nearby training field. He stood well above 6 feet tall and carried a 2-handed great sword wider than Rain's palm. The armor covering his body appeared almost weightless when he moved. The man was Instructor Perez. Perez raised his great sword over his head. A thick stone pillar stood in front of him. His blade descended. Silver light flashed across the courtyard. A clean crack followed. The upper half of the pillar slid sideways. It crashed into the ground and filled the area with dust. The cut surface was smooth as glass. Noble trainees immediately applauded. Rain could only stare. The pillar was thick enough that one person could barely wrap both arms around it. Perez had cut through the entire thing with one swing. No ordinary human could produce that result. The stories Rain had heard were no longer distant rumors. This world truly possessed supernatural power. Rain looked at his system panel. Becoming an ordinary blacksmith suddenly felt less satisfying. He could master a profession and still remain helpless before beings capable of splitting stone. Rain made a decision in that courtyard. If a path toward extraordinary power existed, he would find it. He refused to spend his new life drifting helplessly toward death. A noble girl soon gave him another glimpse of that higher world. She stepped away from the squire group wearing fitted hunting clothes. Her chestnut hair was tied in a ponytail. Even from the side, Rain could see the confidence in her posture. Her body looked lean rather than bulky. Yet she challenged Instructor Perez to a sparring match. Perez accepted. Their first collision sent sparks through the air. The girl wielded a great sword almost as enormous as Perez's. She met his blade head-on with a jumping slash. Metal crashed against metal like a hammer striking an anvil. Rain's remaining doubts vanished. Perez was a massive adult warrior. This opponent was a teenage girl. Yet she generated force that no normal human body should possess. She moved around Perez with astonishing speed. The great sword in her hands seemed almost weightless. Perez defended every strike without counterattacking. Then the girl leaped several meters into the air. Her body tightened like a drawn bow. She unleashed a diagonal cleave. The resulting collision was deafening. Rain stood dozens of meters away and still felt pain in his ears. Most of the noble trainees covered their heads. Only a handful continued watching without flinching. A small fragment broke from one of the swords. It shot across the courtyard. The metal buried itself in the earth less than a meter from Rain. Perez and the girl both looked toward him. For one terrible instant, Rain felt like prey beneath the eyes of predators. They were only checking whether the fragment had injured someone. Their attention soon returned to training. That brief glance allowed Rain to see the girl's face clearly. She had bold eyebrows and striking brown-gray eyes. Her name was Kreia. Rain later learned that she was Count Habsburg's youngest daughter. Kreia apologized for damaging Perez's weapon. She promised to have the sword repaired. When the squires resumed training, Rain quietly retrieved the metal fragment. It felt strangely heavy. The material was neither bronze nor ordinary steel. Fish scale hammer marks covered its edge. Layer after layer revealed extremely careful forging. Rain estimated that Perez's complete sword might weigh 70 or 80 pounds. Such a weapon was several times heavier than practical medieval swords from his previous world. Perez's size could partly explain his ability to use it. Kreia was different. Her slender frame had controlled a similarly massive blade with ease. Rain wondered whether secret training techniques created that strength. Perhaps supernatural ability was inherited through noble bloodlines. If training was responsible, Rain might have a chance. He had never learned swordsmanship. Commoners might consider him too old to begin. But Rain possessed something none of them knew about. He had the system. Trimming a donkey's hoof had created a profession panel. Basic combat training might do the same thing. The servant program included sword lessons. Rain began wondering what profession would awaken. Swordsman sounded ideal. Warrior would also be acceptable. Even a simple combat profession could become his first step upward. Rain wrapped the sword fragment in cloth. He placed it inside his pocket. Then he returned to holding donkey hooves, while thoughts of supernatural power burned in his mind. That evening, Rain dragged his exhausted body back to the servant dormitory. More than a dozen boys shared one long sleeping platform. Richard and his friends controlled the comfortable places in the middle. Rain slept near the edge. Richard ordered him to clean the entire room. It was actually Richard's turn. Rain wanted to fight. He truly did. Then he examined his thin arms. Richard stood half a head taller. Rain swallowed his anger. He pretended to obey without resistance. Richard shoved him and walked away. Rain spent more than an hour sweeping and wiping the room. He secretly watched for another system notification. Nothing happened. No servant profession appeared. No cleaner profession appeared either. Perhaps those professions did not exist. Or perhaps Rain had not worked long enough to activate them. That night he lay awake and considered his future. Knowledge from his previous world could potentially make him valuable. He even thought about gunpowder. The idea was immediately discarded. A servant trainee could not simply approach Count Habsburg with a revolutionary weapon formula. Going through a middleman was equally dangerous. Rain would have no believable explanation for his knowledge. One mistake could get him imprisoned or killed. In a supernatural world, personal power was safer than mysterious inventions. Leveling his system came first. The following day, Rain continued trimming donkey hooves. It was the manor's final day of donkey work. His hoof-trimming skill had already advanced considerably. Rain became anxious as his current source of experience disappeared. The next morning, Master Bar announced a new lesson. They would shoe horses. First, they needed to trim the horse's hooves. Rain's entire mood changed. The hoof-trimming skill never specified what kind of animal was required. A horse hoof should still count. He only needed to confirm it. The trainees moved near the stables. Several boys groaned after seeing the horses. Holding a donkey was already difficult. Holding a frightened draft horse looked much worse. Rain could barely contain his excitement. Bar selected a smaller draft horse. Even that animal was larger than the biggest donkey Rain had handled. Rain and George were called forward first. They secured the hoof. Bar measured a horseshoe against it. He trimmed the excess material. Then he began driving nails into the hoof. 7 holes required 7 nails. The horse struggled harder with each impact. Rain and George strained until sweat soaked their clothes. When the 4th hoof was completed, the system finally responded. Rain had assisted with horse hoof trimming. Hoof trimming gained 4 experience points. His blacksmith apprentice profession also gained experience. Rain's pulse accelerated. Donkey hoof work had given only 1 skill point at a time. Horse work produced 4. Profession experience also accumulated much faster. Rain finally saw the system's logic. The closer an activity was to the core of a profession, the greater its value. Horseshoeing was more relevant to blacksmithing than trimming donkeys. Higher professional relevance meant faster advancement. Rain felt as though an enormous door had opened. Near noon, another system message appeared. He had learned horseshoeing. A second icon illuminated on his profession panel. Rain now understood how new skills were unlocked. Serious study created comprehension. Enough comprehension awakened the related skill. Practical repetition then increased its level. Rain threw himself into horseshoeing with almost frightening concentration. Kreia appeared on the nearby training field again. Rain barely looked at her. At lunch, George finally commented on the change. Rain worked until his body could literally no longer move. George said he looked possessed. Rain claimed that he had simply realized the importance of learning a trade. The explanation was believable. George knew Rain's family situation. His own parents were free citizens who owned land. Rain's father worked as a tenant farmer. Rain's mother had no reliable income. A 7-year-old sister also depended on the family. Nobody questioned why a poor boy might desperately pursue a valuable craft. While working, Rain continued listening to other trainees. Richard's group had more disturbing news. A pirate crew known as the Black Sails had landed on the coast. They were attacking small settlements. A fishing port had suffered especially heavy losses. Even the local sheriff had been killed. Sheriffs were usually warriors close to night level. The news revealed how dangerous the pirates were. Shining Gold Town's current sheriff, Sir Kuzma, was being transferred to the affected port. A new sheriff named Hamilton would arrive from the county capital. Pirates were killing powerful warriors. Children were disappearing. Ogres wandered between towns. Rain's new world was far less peaceful than it looked. He needed strength quickly. Master Bar noticed his exhaustion and offered him a rest. Rain refused. Bar had begun treating him more kindly. The boy's obsessive enthusiasm had changed the blacksmith's opinion. Rain appreciated the goodwill. He still refused to waste an opportunity for experience. 2 days of horseshoeing pushed hoof trimming to the edge of its next level. Rain watched Bar smooth a hoof. The system suddenly announced that hoof trimming had reached level 2. Something shifted inside Rain. Fragmented training memories flowed into his mind. It felt as if he had spent months performing the same work. Bar's tiny movements suddenly made sense. Rain understood why the blacksmith changed his wrist angle near a sharp curve. He understood the small jolt used to remove excess material. Techniques that had looked mysterious now seemed natural. Rain knew he could trim a hoof himself. Full horseshoeing remained beyond his experience. The trimming portion no longer did. No other trainee had reached that stage. Asking for independent work would draw attention. Rain disliked unnecessary attention, but performing the task himself should provide far more experience than assisting. His profession level was progressing too slowly. Rain decided the reward outweighed the risk. He asked Master Bar for permission to try. Bar studied him carefully. The blacksmith remembered Rain's effort during the previous days. Finally, he agreed. Every trainee stopped to watch. Richard and his friends immediately interpreted the request as showing off. They quietly promised to teach Rain another lesson that evening. Bar handed Rain the heavy scraper. Rain misjudged its weight and stumbled. Laughter exploded from Richard's group. Even Bar appeared doubtful. George said nothing. He simply held the horse's hoof as firmly as possible. Rain adjusted his grip. His first movement looked slightly clumsy. Then the system-granted comprehension took over. He used the scraper's weight. He followed the natural curve of the hoof. Bar's eyes changed. The boy genuinely knew what he was doing. Richard's group became quiet. George stared in disbelief. Rain had learned in several days what other trainees still could not perform. Freckles dismissed the achievement. He said hoofwork had nothing to do with swordsmanship. Rain did not care. His attention was on the system. Performing the work personally gave several times more experience. Profession experience also increased. Rain had found another acceleration method. Bar soon allowed him to trim independently. Rain handled the hoof. Bar attached the shoe. Their work became faster. The blacksmith was clearly satisfied. The atmosphere among the trainees became noticeably colder. At lunch, only George spoke with Rain. Some boys were jealous. Others probably feared Richard's group. Rain refused to slow his growth for either reason. Near evening, the system gave him the reward he had been chasing. Blacksmith Apprentice reached level 2. Rain received 1 attribute point. He also received 1 skill point. Those points were the true value of profession advancement. Rain immediately examined his attributes. Strength remained his greatest weakness. It was also the reason Richard could bully him physically. Rain placed the attribute point into strength. His strength rose from 4 to 5. Warmth surged from his heart. It spread through every muscle. The exhaustion accumulated throughout the day vanished. Rain felt capable of trimming another 100 hooves. He considered spending the skill point on horseshoeing. Then he stopped. Higher profession levels required increasingly more experience. Skill points might become extremely precious. Horseshoeing could still be improved naturally. A difficult future skill such as weapon forging might be far harder to train. Rain saved the point. When he returned to work, everyone noticed another difference. His movements were smoother. His speed had increased. Nearby trainees stared. Rain's appetite also transformed. At dinner, he ate several blocks of black bread. He refilled his soup repeatedly. Increased physical strength required energy. Rain's body demanded food like a furnace. After dinner, he approached the dormitory. Richard and Freckles blocked the entrance. Richard stepped forward. He mocked Rain for showing off. Then he lightly slapped Rain's face. The gesture was meant to humiliate him. The old Rain might have lowered his head. Yesterday, even the new Rain might have endured it. Today, his strength was 5. Rain's eyes became cold. He slapped Richard with everything he had. The impact snapped Richard's head sideways. The larger boy stumbled. Before Richard recovered, Rain drove a knee into his stomach. Richard folded forward. His entire dinner spilled across the floor. Freckles screamed for the others to attack. Several boys rushed Rain simultaneously. Rain tucked his chin. He protected his head. Then he continued punching Richard. Rain did not expect to defeat an entire group. He chose one target. Richard had started this. Richard would remember the result. Rain struck him again and again. His own ferocity was almost frightening. The fight ended when other trainees summoned a steward. Fortunately, the steward was connected to Rain's family. He was the same man who had helped Rain enter the training program. The punishment was relatively balanced. Richard and Rain both received a week of cleaning duty. Rain was transferred into George's dormitory. Richard considered the result anything but finished. Nobody had ever beaten him that way. He glared at Rain throughout the following day. Sword training would begin the next week. Richard had already trained with his uncle for 2 years. He promised Freckles that the sparring field would become his revenge. While Richard plotted, Rain kept working. He also began teaching other trainees how to trim properly. Rain explained how to use the scraper's weight. He demonstrated how to follow the hoof's curve. Poorer boys began gathering around him. Richard's influence over the group weakened. Rain saw no disadvantage in helping them. His system allowed him to improve faster. Teaching ordinary trainees would not erase that advantage. More friends and fewer enemies was simply good strategy. By the end of the stable work, Rain had made substantial progress. He still preserved his skill point. A manor steward soon announced the next training schedule. The following day was a rest day. After that, basic sword training would begin. A manor guard named H. Burt would instruct them. The courtyard erupted with excitement. George grabbed Rain's arm. Sword training meant something very different to Rain. A combat profession might finally awaken. Before that happened, Rain was allowed to go home. He would meet the original Rain's family for the first time with his new consciousness. The thought reminded him of his parents from his previous life. Rain had no idea what had happened to them. Sadness briefly overwhelmed him. George distracted him with an invitation. George's uncle worked as a ranger in Hapsburg Manor's private forest. The public forests had already been stripped of most nuts. The private woodland still contained plenty. George proposed a quiet gathering trip. Rain agreed. That evening he walked through shining Gold Town. Memories belonging to the original Rain awakened at every familiar shop. He passed the bakery. He recognized the inn connected to Freckles' family. At the town square, a crowd surrounded the notice board. Rain pushed closer. A new wanted poster had been displayed. The criminal was called Scarface. He had shoulder-length blonde hair and a long face. A scar crossed diagonally from his forehead to his cheek. His real name was unknown. The listed crimes included attacks on several women. Scarface was also suspected in multiple robberies. More disturbingly, he might be connected to recent child disappearances. The bounty was 5 imperial gold coins. Rain briefly imagined what that amount of money could do for his family. Then common sense returned. Hunting a violent criminal was currently far beyond him. Rain continued home. He passed another building and suddenly stopped. It was the town blacksmith shop. Working there might give him profession experience outside manor training. The idea was perfect except for one problem. The owner, Boris Patton, was famously stingy. Boris charged apprentices several silver coins for instruction. Rain's family could not afford that fee. He needed another method. A neighbor greeted him on the south side of town. She immediately said Rain looked stronger. Rain initially assumed she was being polite. Then he examined his arms. Visible muscle had begun forming. The faint outline of abdominal muscles had also appeared. One strength point had already changed his body. Rain finally reached his family's home. It was a two-story house with mud walls and a thatched roof. A woman worked in the small vegetable garden outside. She recognized Rain immediately. Memories surged through him when he saw her face. Warm moments from the original Rain's childhood appeared one after another. Rain called her mother. She embraced him. Something deep inside Rain responded. He could not tell whether the emotion belonged to the body or his own heart. The distinction stopped mattering. She was his mother now. A 7-year-old girl ran from the backyard. Her name was Mint. She was Rain's little sister. Rain lifted her and spun her around. Mint laughed until she could barely breathe. His father returned later. The sturdy farmer had a square jaw and deep lines of worry. Calloused hands rested on Rain's shoulders. His father also noticed that Rain had become stronger. Rain hugged him. The sudden affection surprised the man. A smile soon appeared on his face. Dinner was luxurious by the family's standards. They had salted pork. Mashed potatoes filled a large plate. Rye bread and milk completed the meal. Rain understood that his parents had prepared everything because he came home. He devoured his portion. His stomach still felt empty. The strength increase had transformed his appetite. Rain tried not to look at the remaining food. His mother noticed immediately. She offered him her salted pork. Mint pushed her potatoes toward him. His father began offering bread. Rain stared at the 3 people sacrificing their food without hesitation. Until that moment, his desire for strength had been largely selfish. He wanted freedom. He wanted to explore a supernatural world. He wanted to avoid being crushed by stronger people. Now he had another reason. This family loved him. Rain would become stronger for them as well. He accepted some food from his mother and Mint. He refused his father's bread. A tenant farmer needed energy for physical labor. Rain would find another way to feed himself. The next morning, his parents left for work. Rain found Mint planting carrots in the backyard. Another girl was helping her. Her name was Anna. Anna lived in the neighboring wooden house. She had moved there with her mother approximately a year earlier. Then her mother mysteriously disappeared. Anna now lived alone. Her features were naturally beautiful. Poverty and poor health were equally obvious. Her skin looked pale. Her blonde hair was dry and damaged. Deep brown eyes contained a quiet strength. Anna shyly greeted Rain. Before he could respond properly, George arrived. It was time for their gathering trip. Mint immediately asked to join. Anna's eyes revealed the same desire. Rain refused. They were already entering private woodland through George's ranger uncle. Bringing additional people would be irresponsible. Rain promised to bring nuts back. Mint reluctantly obeyed. On the road, George asked why she spent time with Anna. Some townspeople considered the girl bad luck. Rain asked for an explanation. George had heard that Anna's mother did not simply disappear. Someone had taken her. He did not know who. Then George mentioned 2 children missing from the north side of town. The disappearances affecting surrounding settlements had apparently reached Shining Gold Town. Rain felt a chill. Children were vanishing. Anna's mother had been taken. Scarface was suspected of involvement. Something dark was hiding beneath the peaceful town. Rain and George eventually returned with wild blueberries, hazelnuts, and chestnuts. Most surrounding forests belonged to Habsburg Manor. Without the Rangers' connection, such a harvest would have been impossible. Rain approached home and noticed smoke rising from the chimney. The sight created an unexpected sense of warmth. Then he saw Anna sitting on her front steps. She was eating a cheap bran cake. Anna caught every falling crumb with her free hand. Nothing was wasted. She closed her eyes with visible happiness. Rain felt his chest tighten. What kind of life made someone treasure such terrible food? He considered giving her nuts directly. Anna might refuse out of embarrassment. Rain used Mint instead. He gave half the gathered food to his family. The remaining portion went into Mint's hands. Rain told her to make sure Anna accepted it. Mint took the mission seriously. She even threatened to cry if Anna refused. Several minutes later, Mint returned smiling. Anna had accepted the gift. Rain quietly felt relieved. After lunch, he approached Boris Patton's blacksmith shop. Hammering could be heard before Rain reached the entrance. Heat struck him like a wall inside. Boris was forging while several apprentices moved around the workshop. Rain asked whether he could help. Boris immediately said the shop needed nobody. Rain offered to work without wages. The blacksmith's eyebrows rose. Free labor was a very different proposal. One apprentice suggested putting Rain on the bellows. Operating them required physical effort but almost no secret knowledge. Boris decided Rain had nothing important to steal. He agreed. Rain sat beside the furnace and began pulling. A system notification appeared within minutes. He had learned bellows operation. Every pull increased his comprehension. Profession experience also began accumulating. Rain transformed into a machine. The apprentices could not understand his enthusiasm. Nobody enjoyed bellows work. Rain was performing it for free. Boris used him as an example to shame his lazy apprentices. The entire shop became more productive. Boris was delighted. Rain worked until darkness covered the town. Then Blacksmith Apprentice reached level 3. He gained another attribute point. 2 skill points were now available. The next profession level required much more experience. Rain did not care. Boris believed he had obtained free labor. Rain knew the system rewards were worth more than any wages the smith could offer. He returned to Habsburg Manor and collapsed into sleep. The following morning, sword training finally began. Egbert was a tall and powerfully built manor guard. Golden hair stood from his head like rough bristles. A hand-and-a-half sword hung at his hip. His posture possessed the stable confidence of an experienced fighter. Egbert introduced himself as their sword instructor. He would teach the basic swordsmanship used by militia soldiers. Richard immediately announced his previous training. Egbert allowed him to demonstrate. Richard performed several techniques with an ironwood practice sword. To complete beginners, he looked impressive. Egbert merely said the performance was not bad. Rain noticed the man's faint disappointment. Richard had trained for 2 years. Rain had never properly held a sword in either life. For the moment, Richard genuinely possessed the advantage. Egbert led everyone to the central training ground. Real swords and armor stood beneath a covered shelter. None of those weapons belonged to the trainees. Egbert pointed toward wooden short swords. The practice weapons were made from oil-soaked ironwood. Their weight was surprisingly close to real iron blades. Freckles mocked the childish-looking equipment. He and Richard both believed their previous experience made them untouchable. Freckles specifically mocked Rain. According to him, talent for trimming hooves meant nothing with a sword. George wanted to argue. Rain stopped him. Words would give him no experience. Egbert demonstrated 3 basic forms. The first was a stepping thrust. The second was a stepping downward slash. The third was a stepping upward sweep. They were the same movements Richard had demonstrated. Egbert made them look completely different. His footwork was sharp. His power transferred cleanly from the ground through his waist. Every blade movement was precise. The trainees began copying him. Rain immediately discovered how difficult basic swordsmanship really was. His feet and sword arm needed perfect coordination. Power began in the rear leg. The waist transferred that force. The arm guided it into the weapon. Rain possessed no useful muscle memory. They trained under the blazing sun. Sweat soaked the entire group. Egbert walked between them and corrected mistakes. He constantly reminded the boys that training could determine whether they survived future danger. His enthusiasm was surprisingly effective. Then Rain's system reacted. He had learned basic swordsmanship. A new profession panel appeared. Militia. Rain initially felt disappointed. He had hoped for swordsman. Warrior also sounded respectable. Militia sounded painfully ordinary. After thinking carefully, Rain understood. He was a complete beginner. The system created professions based on his actual ability. A lower profession might also require less experience. For someone starting from nothing, an easier ladder was useful. Rain's disappointment became excitement. This was his first combat profession. It was his first real step toward extraordinary power. Only basic swordsmanship was visible on the militia skill panel. 2 hours of practice produced almost no progress. Rain calculated the natural training speed. Reaching level 2 could take months. Servant trainees rotated between different subjects. Sword training would not continue every day. At that rate, the selection exam might arrive before Rain became truly competitive. He refused to accept that. Rain spent 1 saved skill point. Basic swordsmanship immediately reached level 2. Training memories flooded his mind. Countless repetitions seemed compressed into 1 instant. His muscles suddenly remembered movements they had never practiced. Rain swung again. The difference was enormous. His steps became smoother. His waist moved naturally. The blade no longer felt unfamiliar. It was equivalent to spending a month training for hours every day. Better skill also increased his profession experience more quickly. George stared with his mouth open. He accused Rain of secretly learning swordsmanship. Rain pointed out that his family could never afford lessons. George considered the logic. Then he reached an astonishing conclusion. Rain might be a sword genius. Rain downplayed his ability. It was still only basic swordsmanship. Noble families possessed far more advanced techniques. George accepted the explanation. Richard and Freckles did not. Rain was rapidly approaching Richard's level. They could not understand how a tenant farmer's son learned so quickly. Egbert also watched Rain. The instructor was impressed but cautious. Some students pretended to be beginners after receiving previous training. Those false geniuses quickly reached their true limits. Egbert waited to see whether Rain would plateau. Rain secretly reduced his speed. He deliberately allowed minor inaccuracies. Revealing his entire improvement would attract too much attention. Across the field, Krya arrived with the noble squires. As Count Habsburg's youngest daughter, she attracted attention wherever she went. Krya examined the servant trainees. Freckles looked reasonably capable. Richard was more polished, but showed signs of having trained beforehand. Then she noticed Rain. He was still thin. Sweat covered his body. His form was not perfect. What interested Krya was the visible improvement between repetitions. She asked an attendant about him. Rain was simply the son of a tenant farmer. A noble youth named Dennis dismissed the servant trainees as low-born commoners. Krya's expression immediately became cold. She reminded Dennis that they were subjects of the Habsburg family. She refused to treat them as worthless. Krya even mentioned political changes in the distant Eagle Federation. Commoners there were entering parliament, yet some local nobles still believed blood alone made them superior. Dennis flushed with anger. He did not dare challenge Count Habsburg's daughter. 5 days passed. Rain gradually revealed more of his level 2 swordsmanship. Bert became convinced that the boy possessed genuine talent. He began viewing Rain as potential guard material. Perhaps Rain might even become a guard captain someday. Then Bert announced sparring practice. Fighting someone at a similar level was the fastest way to improve. His first demonstration pair was almost inevitable. Rain and Richard stepped forward. Ironwood swords pointed toward each other. Richard's hostility was obvious. Rain had humiliated him in the dormitory. Hoof-trimming talent had been irritating. Catching him in swordsmanship was unforgivable. Both boys attacked. Richard's longer reach gave him the first advantage. Rain deflected the thrust. The impact pushed him backward 3 steps. Richard moved only 1. His physical strength was still superior. Richard immediately became confident. 2 years of training should defeat raw talent. At that moment, he was not completely wrong. Rain estimated that Richard's basic swordsmanship was approximately level 3. Rain remained at level 2. Richard increased the pressure. Rain defended. Then he noticed where the attacks were landing. Richard targeted his shoulder. Another strike moved toward Rain's eyes. This was no longer ordinary sparring. Richard intended to injure him badly. A damaged sword arm could remove Rain from training for weeks. An eye injury could be permanent. Rain's patience disappeared. He spent his final skill point. Basic swordsmanship reached level 3. Months of imaginary drills entered his muscle memory. Rain froze for a fraction of a second. Richard saw an opening. His practice sword descended toward Rain's right shoulder. At level 2, Rain might have failed to stop it. At level 3, everything felt different. The sword became an extension of his arm. Rain blocked. This time his feet did not move backward. Richard immediately spun into another attack. The blade traveled directly toward Rain's face. Bert prepared to intervene. Rain's body reacted first. He leaned backward. His weapon caught Richard's blade. Rain used his core to snap upright. The counterattack flowed without hesitation. His wooden sword cracked against Richard's wrist. Richard lost his grip. The ironwood weapon hit the ground. Silence covered the training field. The reversal had happened too quickly. Bert's eyes brightened. He had underestimated Rain. Krya was also watching from horseback. The farmer's son had become considerably more interesting. Bert declared Rain the winner. Then Rain saw the system rewards. Basic swordsmanship gained significant experience. His militia profession also advanced. One brief fight had produced the equivalent of days of isolated practice. Bert's lesson was absolutely correct. Combat against a suitable opponent accelerated improvement. Rain looked toward Richard. The defeated boy's expression was blank. His eyes were not. Dark hatred remained there. Rain knew Richard would not forget. The tavern owner's son knew drunks, former mercenaries, and questionable men throughout town. The conflict might soon move beyond training. Rain still noticed one immediate problem. Richard would never willingly spar with him again. Nobody else in the trainee group was close to Rain's level. George could be defeated with one swing. Fighting him produced almost no experience. Bert noticed the situation. The instructor personally offered to spar with Rain. Every trainee became silent. Personal instruction from Bert was equivalent to private tutoring. Richard looked ready to explode. Bert told Rain not to hold back. Rain launched a full-power stepping thrust. Bert blocked it effortlessly. His counterattack forced Rain to retreat. Rain immediately understood what the instructor was doing. Bert controlled his strength to match Rain's maximum limit. Every exchange forced Rain to his ceiling without crushing him. They traded more than a dozen blows in seconds. Rain separated from Bert while gasping for air. The system notifications were extraordinary. Half a minute against Bert produced days of ordinary training value. A skilled opponent could feed Rain the exact attacks he needed to learn. Bert praised his progress. Rain's swordsmanship was already comparable to that of an ordinary militia fighter. The instructor warned him against arrogance. Practice officially ended. The other trainees collapsed in relief. Rain remained standing. His militia profession was only a few points from leveling. Hbert noticed the hungry look in his eyes. Rain requested another spar. The instructor agreed. Rain's body was actually close to collapse. He secretly spent his saved attribute point on strength. His strength reached the level of an average adult man. Warm energy spread through his exhausted muscles. His stamina recovered instantly. Rain sparred with Hbert repeatedly. After several rounds, even the instructor was sweating. Rain kept asking for more. His militia profession reached 99 experience points. He needed one more. Hbert finally refused. The instructor carefully explained that excessive training could become harmful. Rain insisted that he was not tired. Hbert looked at the darkening sky. Then he admitted that he had something to do at home. Rain watched his instructor leave with genuine heartbreak. One experience point separated him from another profession level. He could hardly chase Hbert and drag him back. A maid suddenly approached. Head maid Shadia wanted Rain in the rear garden. Rain's frustration vanished. He told George to inform his parents that he might return late. The maid led Rain through the castle's rear gate. It was his first time entering the private garden. Shadia waited among the flowers. She was a stern woman around 40 years old. Kreia stood in the center of the garden. The noble girl was practicing with her great sword. Count Habsburg's youngest daughter had personally summoned a tenant farmer's son. Rain had only hoped that a manor guard might notice him. This exceeded every expectation. Kreia told him to choose a sword. The nearby rack held real sharpened steel. Rain selected a long sword similar to his training weapon. It was the first truly sharp blade he had held in either life. His hands trembled slightly. Kreia selected a hand-and-a-half sword. She attacked without wasting time. Rain blocked the first strike. 3 rapid slashes followed. Rain stumbled backward. He barely deflected each blow. 3 seconds later, Kreia's blade rested against his throat. She had deliberately matched her physical strength to his. The difference was entirely skill. Yet those 3 seconds gave Rain exactly what he needed. His militia profession gained the final experience point. It leveled up. Rain received another attribute point. He also gained a skill point. Kreia judged his swordsmanship as decent for a trainee. She believed he had talent. His physical ability disappointed her. In her opinion, Rain's chance of becoming a true knight was slim. Rain saw the interest fading from her eyes. He immediately asked for another opportunity. Kreia raised an eyebrow. Rain spent his new attribute point on agility. Warmth restored his stamina. His speed increased. Kreia's previous attacks had simply been too fast for him to track. Agility was the direct answer. Kreia almost refused the request. Something in Rain's expression changed her mind. She granted him one final chance. Rain attacked. His stepping speed was visibly faster. Kreia's eyes widened slightly. Rain's restored stamina also allowed him to fight at full intensity. Steel rang through the garden. Even Shadia became surprised. Kreia eventually knocked Rain backward and ended the exchange. She simply told him that he had done very well. Rain could not read her final decision. He bowed and left. After his departure, Shadia questioned Kreia's interest. Noble youths like Dennis and Marcus were already far ahead of Rain. Kreia believed the comparison was misleading. Dennis was a baron's son. He had practiced his family's night breathing technique since childhood. Considering his advantages, his progress was mediocre. Marcus had consumed enhancement medicine from an early age. His rapid growth had damaged his future potential. Rain possessed almost none of their resources, yet he had improved at a frightening rate. Kreia believed becoming extraordinary required determination, talent, perseverance, and opportunity. Rain had already shown determination. His training revealed perseverance. The sparring match confirmed talent. Kreia could personally provide opportunity. Rain knew nothing about her conclusion. Someone else was already preparing to destroy his future. Richard sat inside his family's tavern with a former mercenary called Drunk Jack. Jack had become a useless drunk who spent his days chasing alcohol. Richard placed silver coins on the table. His request was simple. Break Rain's sword hand. Jack demanded more money. Richard reluctantly increased the payment. Rain was traveling home that evening. Jack followed him through the fading light. Rain heard footsteps. Then air moved behind his head. His improved agility saved him. Rain lunged forward. The club intended for his skull smashed into his back. Pain exploded through him. A spinal blow was still better than a crushed skull. Jack froze in surprise. Rain turned and grabbed the club. The mercenary was stronger. Jack relaxed after feeling Rain's physical weakness. Rain immediately kicked him between the legs. Jack released the weapon. He collapsed. Rain seized the club and struck his temple. The entire fight lasted seconds. Rain's hands trembled afterward. This had not been training. His attacker had genuinely intended to cripple him. Without the recent attribute improvements, Rain might already be unconscious. He dragged Jack into nearby trees. Thick vines secured the mercenary against a trunk. Rain removed the cloth covering his face. He immediately recognized drunk Jack. The connection to Richard was obvious. Rain woke Jack with a slap. The mercenary threatened him. Rain stuffed Jack's filthy sock into his mouth. The smell alone brought tears to the man's eyes. Rain asked who had hired him. Jack initially refused. Rain calmly described how a bleeding body in the forest might attract wild animals. Jack had no close family in town. His disappearance might remain unnoticed for weeks. Rain explained everything with frightening logic. Jack's contempt slowly became fear. The former mercenary finally confessed. Richard had paid him to break Rain's hand. Rain's suspicions were confirmed. Before he could decide what to do next, a twig snapped behind him. A tall figure stood among the trees. A sword hung from the stranger's hip. Rain ran. The stranger followed without effort. Rain eventually stopped behind a large tree. A voice suddenly spoke beside him. The stranger had already moved ahead. Rain understood the difference in strength. Escape was impossible. He spent his final skill point. Basic swordsmanship reached level 4. Rain attacked with everything he possessed. The stranger caught his weapon with one hand. Rain could not move it even slightly. Then the man calmly identified himself as Hamilton Shining Goldtown's new sheriff. The Imperial Knight promised to handle drunk Jack, but he also warned Rain that the recent child disappearances were connected to a danger far larger than one tavern boy's revenge. Rain's path soon carried him through Krya's giant bear breathing technique, the blacksmith profession, and the deadly promotion that turned a servant trainee into a true night watchman. He survived the ferocious gnoll called Savage Claw, fought beside Hamilton, and learned that victory against one monster only revealed stronger creatures waiting beyond the town. At Glimmer Lake, Rain and Willen slaughtered a migrating tribe of evil-finned fishmen only to discover enormous ogre tracks leading from the bloody riverbank into the deep forest. While Hamilton strengthened the town's patrols, Poison Blade of the Wilderness Brotherhood entered Richard's family tavern and quietly accepted an order to erase the farmer's son. Rain walked forward unaware, but every skill wound in battle had already forged him into a man who would never die quietly.